He made me kneel in front of his mistress like I was nothing. 10 years of marriage, 3 beautiful children, and he treated me like trash. But what he didn't know? I wasn't just his wife. I was the silent storm he should have never provoked. And honey, when I struck back, he learned real quick. You don't break a queen and expect to keep your throne. Before we start, let me say this. What you're about to hear isn't your typical revenge story. This is about power, secrets, and the dangerous game people play when they forget who really holds the cards. If you love stories where the underdog comes out on top, smash that subscribe button right now. Trust me, you'll want to see how this ends. Now, let me tell you about the day my entire life changed, and how the man who had everything lost it, all because he forgot one simple truth. Never underestimate a woman who built you from nothing. My name is Naya, and if you saw me 10 years ago, you'd think I had it all figured out. Designer clothes, a mansion that could fit 3 regular houses inside it, luxury cars, and a husband who was on the cover of Forbes magazine. But let me take you back further, because that's where the real story begins. That's where the truth lives that nobody knew about. I grew up in a small town in North Carolina. My grandmother was a brilliant woman, the kind of person who could look at a plant and know exactly what it could do for your body. She spent her whole life researching natural remedies, working in her little laboratory that she built in our garage. People thought she was just making home remedies, but my grandmother was a genius. She developed a skincare formula that could reverse aging, heal scars, and transform skin in ways that science couldn't explain. But she never commercialized it. She kept it in her journals, protected it like it was gold, because she said the world wasn't ready for what she created. She said people would steal it, corrupt it, use it for greed instead of healing. When my grandmother passed, she left everything to me. All her research, all her formulas, all her secrets. I was studying biochemistry in college, following in her footsteps, and I understood the magnitude of what she'd given me. I kept it safe. I kept it secret until I met him. Trevor. I met him at a medical research conference where I was presenting some of my own work on natural compounds. He was there trying to network, trying to save his failing cosmetics company. He was charming, confident, and he had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. We talked for hours about innovation, about the future of skincare, about changing the industry. He told me about his vision, his dreams, and how he just needed one breakthrough product to make it all happen. I didn't tell him about my grandmother's formula that night, but something in me felt connected to him. We started dating, and 6 months later, he proposed. It was romantic, it was beautiful, and he promised me the world. But 2 weeks before the wedding, he came to me with tears in his eyes. His company was about to go bankrupt. He was going to lose everything. He'd taken out loans he couldn't repay, and investors were pulling out. He was desperate. That's when I made the biggest mistake of my life. I told him about my grandmother's formula. I showed him the research, explained how it worked, and watched his eyes light up like he'd just won the lottery. He begged me to let him use it, promised that we'd be partners, that we'd build an empire together. He said once we were married, everything would be ours anyway, so why not save his company with it? Against my family's warnings, against my own gut feeling, I gave it to him. I signed over the rights to the base formula as a wedding gift. I trusted him completely. Within a year, his company exploded. The product we launched became the most sought-after skincare line in the world. Celebrities were using it, influencers were going crazy over it, and the money started pouring in faster than we could count it. Trevor went from almost bankrupt to billionaire in 18 months. Magazine covers, interviews, speaking engagements. He became the face of innovation in the beauty industry. And me, I was the supportive wife in the background, smiling at charity galas, raising our children, being the perfect partner. But here's what nobody knew. Trevor never made me an official partner in the company. Every time I brought it up, he'd say the business structure was complicated. that we'd handle it later, that it didn't matter because we were married, and what's his was mine anyway. I believed him. I focused on our family, on our 3 kids, on building our home. I thought we were building a life together. I didn't know he was building an empire on my foundation while planning to kick me out of it. Everything changed 2 years ago. Trevor hired a new brand director named Fallon. She was young, ambitious, and brilliant at marketing. I actually liked her at first. I mentored her, taught her about the products, shared insights about the formula's origins. She seemed genuinely passionate about the work, always asking questions, always wanting to learn more. I thought I was helping another woman rise. I didn't realize I was training my replacement. The signs were there, but I ignored them. Trevor started working late every night. His phone was always face down. He'd come home smelling like perfume that wasn't mine. When I'd ask about his day, he'd be vague, distant. The warmth between us disappeared, replaced by cold efficiency. We became roommates who happened to have children together. But I kept hoping things would get better. I kept thinking it was just stress from the business, that we'd find our way back to each other. Then came the night I overheard them. I'd gone to the office to surprise Trevor with dinner because he'd been working so late. The building was quiet. Most people had gone home. I walked toward his office and heard voices. His door was slightly open, and I heard him laugh in a way he hadn't laughed with me in years. I stood there in the hallway, holding a bag of his favorite food, and listened to my husband tell another woman that he loved her. But it wasn't just the affair that broke me. It was what they said next. Fallon's voice was clear and calculating. She told Trevor they needed to find a way to recreate the formula without me, that I was a liability, that the company would be worth more if they could cut me out completely. And Trevor, my husband, the father of my children, the man I'd saved from bankruptcy, agreed. He said he'd been looking for a way to phase me out, that I'd become comfortable and complacent, that Fallon brought excitement and ambition to his life that I no longer did. I left the building before they saw me. I drove home in silence, my mind racing, my heart shattered into pieces. But somewhere between the office and our mansion, something shifted inside me. The tears stopped. The heartbreak hardened into something else. Clarity, cold, sharp clarity. The final humiliation came 3 weeks later, at our company's 10th anniversary gala. It was supposed to be a celebration of everything we'd built. I'd planned the entire event, invited everyone who mattered in the industry. I wore a custom dress, had my hair and makeup done perfectly, played the role of the proud wife, supporting her brilliant husband. But Trevor had other plans. During his speech, he announced that Fallon was being promoted to co-founder and chief innovation officer. He rewrote the entire history of the company, crediting her with the creative vision behind our products. He talked about her brilliance, her dedication, her innovative spirit. My name was mentioned once as his supportive wife. 10 years of my grandmother's legacy, reduced to a footnote. I tried to hold it together, but after the speech, I pulled Trevor aside. I told him this was unacceptable, that he was erasing my contribution, that Fallon didn't deserve that title. He looked at me with such cold contempt that I barely recognized him. He grabbed my arm and dragged me to a private room where Fallon was waiting. That's when he told me to kneel. He said if I wanted to remain part of this family, if I wanted to keep living in our home and being around my children, I needed to apologize to Fallon for causing drama. He said I was embarrassing him with my jealousy and insecurity, and then he told me to get on my knees and beg for her forgiveness. I looked at Fallon, and she smiled. She actually smiled, like she'd won some sick game. So I did it. I got on my knees in my expensive dress, in front of the woman who was sleeping with my husband, and I apologized. But while I was down there, while Trevor was standing over me feeling powerful, and Fallon was enjoying my humiliation, I did something they didn't notice. I took out my phone in my pocket and hit record. I captured every word, every threat, every sick moment of what they were doing to me. That night, After we got home, and Trevor fell asleep satisfied with himself, I didn't cry, I didn't break down. I went to my grandmother's old laboratory that I'd kept exactly as she left it. I went through her journals, really studied them for the first time in years. And that's when I discovered the truth that would change everything. The formula I'd given Trevor was incomplete. My grandmother had developed it in two parts: the base formula that I'd signed over, and an activation compound that she kept separate. Without the activation compound, the base formula would work beautifully for about 2 years, and then it would start to fail. Customers would develop reactions, skin problems, discoloration. The products would go from miracle workers to toxic nightmares, and we were at month 22. I sat in that laboratory until sunrise, reading every page of my grandmother's research, understanding the genius of what she'd created and the protection she'd built into it. She'd known that if someone stole her work, they'd eventually destroy themselves with it. And I still had the only copy of the activation compound formula. Without it, Trevor's entire empire was about to crumble, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. I didn't go to Trevor with this information. I didn't warn him. I waited. I played the dutiful wife. I smiled at breakfast, took care of our kids, attended company events, and I watched. 3 months later, the first customer complaints started appearing online. People's skin was breaking out in severe reactions, rashes, burns, discoloration that wouldn't fade. Social media exploded with angry customers demanding answers. The company's reputation started tanking overnight. Trevor panicked. He threw millions of dollars at scientists, trying to figure out what went wrong. He reformulated, he tested, he tried everything. But nothing worked because he didn't understand that the formula was designed to fail without its missing piece. The stock price dropped 40% in 2 weeks. Investors were furious. The board demanded answers he couldn't give. That's when the lawsuits started. Class action suits from customers who'd been harmed. Millions of dollars in legal fees. The company that Trevor had built into a billion-dollar empire was collapsing. And he had no idea why. I watched him age 10 years in 10 weeks. I watched Fallon start distancing herself, suddenly too busy to take his calls. I watched everything fall apart exactly as my grandmother's formula was designed to do. When things got desperate enough, Trevor finally came to me. He showed up at the house one afternoon while the kids were at school, and he looked broken. He asked if I knew anything about what was happening, if my grandmother's original research might have answers. I looked at him calmly and said I didn't know, that I'd given him everything years ago. I lied right to his face, the same way he'd been lying to me. The company was weeks away from total collapse when I made my move. I called an emergency board meeting, something I technically had the right to do as Trevor's wife and the original contributor to the company's foundation. Trevor was confused, but desperate enough to allow it. The boardroom filled with investors, lawyers, and executives who were all looking for someone to blame. I walked in with my grandmother's original research journals and a lawyer specializing in intellectual property. I presented the complete history of the formula, showed them my grandmother's notes, and proved with documentation that I'd only ever signed over the base formula. The activation compound, the crucial piece that made the formula stable and safe, had never been included in any contract. I still owned it. Legally, completely, undeniably. I owned the only thing that could save the company. The room went silent. Trevor's face went white. Fallon, who was sitting beside him, playing supportive partner, suddenly looked like she wanted to disappear. The board members started talking over each other, demanding to know if this was true, if I really had the solution. My lawyer confirmed every word. Then I laid out my terms. I would give them the activation compound and save the company, but only under specific conditions. First, Trevor would be immediately removed as CEO and would retain only 10% ownership. Second, I would become the majority owner with 65% of the company. Third, Fallon would be fired immediately and blacklisted from the industry with a non-compete clause. Fourth, the company would be publicly rebranded with proper acknowledgement of my grandmother's legacy and my contribution. And fifth, Trevor would publicly apologize for his fraud and for stealing credit for work that wasn't his. Trevor stood up, his face red with rage and humiliation. He tried to argue, tried to intimidate me the way he always had, but the board shut him down. They told him he had no leverage, no options, and if he didn't accept my terms, the company would collapse completely, and he'd likely face criminal charges for fraud and misrepresentation. They gave him 1 hour to decide. 58 minutes later, Trevor came back into that boardroom, and he got on his knees, right there in front of the entire board, in front of Fallon, in front of everyone who'd watched him humiliate me. He knelt down and begged. He begged me to save the company, begged me to have mercy, promised he'd do anything I asked. I looked down at him the same way he'd looked down at me that night at the gala, and I felt nothing but cold satisfaction. I told him I'd accept his surrender, but not his apology, because sorry doesn't fix betrayal. Then I turned to the board and told them to draw up the papers. Within 72 hours, I owned the company. Trevor was out, and Fallon was escorted from the building, with nothing but a box of her personal items and a ruined reputation. I released the activation compound to the company's scientists, and within months, we'd reformulated every product. We compensated affected customers, rebuilt our reputation, and came back stronger than ever. I rebranded the company with my grandmother's name, created a foundation for young Black women in STEM, and turned the empire that was built on my family's legacy into something that actually honored it. Trevor tried to come back several times over the next year. He'd show up at the house wanting to talk, wanting to reconcile, wanting access to his old life. But I'd changed the locks, changed my number, and changed my life. I gave him supervised visitation with our kids because they deserved to know their father, but he would never touch my life again. I made sure of that legally, emotionally, and financially. Today, I'm running a multi-billion-dollar company that actually does good in the world. My children are proud of their mother and understand the legacy they come from. And Trevor, he's living in a nice apartment that his 10% pays for, watching from the sidelines as the empire he thought he built thrives without him. Fallon ended up working in retail last I heard, her big career dreams shattered by her own greed. So there you have it. The man who made me kneel learned the hardest lesson: never bite the hand that feeds you. He thought he was the empire. He forgot I was the foundation. Here's what I need you to understand. Your value isn't determined by how others treat you. It's determined by what you know you bring to the table. And sometimes, you have to let people lose everything to realize what they had. Now drop a comment and tell me, do you think I should have saved his company, or should I have let it all burn? I want to hear your thoughts. If this story fired you up, hit that like button so more people can see it. Share this with anyone who needs a reminder about knowing their worth. And subscribe, because I've got more stories that'll make you think twice about who really has the power. Remember, they can try to erase you from the story, but they can't erase the fact that you wrote it. Stay powerful, stay smart, and never forget what you bring to the table. Until next time, stay blessed and stay dangerous. He threw me out at midnight, 7 months pregnant, saying I wasn't good enough for his family. What he didn't know, my father owned the company that was about to fire him. Sometimes karma doesn't just knock. She kicks the door down, wearing designer heels. This is my story. Before we dive into this story, if you love tales about karma, justice, and people getting exactly what they deserve, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Drop a comment telling me what you would have done in my situation. Trust me, you're gonna want to see how this plays out. Now, let me take you back to the worst night of my life. My name is Aaliyah Thompson, and 3 years ago, I made a decision that would change my life forever. I decided to hide who I really was to find real love. You see, my father, Thomas Thompson, is a billionaire. Real estate, investments, corporations, His empire is worth more money than most people see in 10 lifetimes. Growing up, I watched women flock to the men in my father's circle, and men approach me with dollar signs in their eyes. I wanted something different. I wanted someone to love me, not for my last name or my bank account. So when I moved out at 25, I didn't tell anyone who my father was. I got a job as an elementary school teacher, rented a modest apartment, and lived a simple life. That's when I met Brandon Clark at a coffee shop in downtown Atlanta. He was charming, handsome, working his way up the corporate ladder as a sales manager. We talked for hours that first day. He made me laugh. He seemed genuine. And for the first time in my life, I felt like someone wanted me, just me. We dated for a year before he proposed. My father met him once and pulled me aside afterward. "Aaliyah," he said, his voice careful, "are you sure about this man? I can run a background check, look into his character." I was so in love, so convinced I'd found the real thing, that I waved him off. "Daddy, I need to do this my way," I told him. He respected that. He always respected my choices, even when he disagreed. That's the kind of man my father is. Brandon and I got married in a small ceremony. His mother, Diane, was there with her tight smile and judgmental eyes. From day one, she made little comments. "Oh, Aaliyah, is that what you're wearing?" Or, "Brandon, darling, are you sure she knows how to host properly?" I tried to brush it off, tried to be the perfect daughter-in-law. We moved into Brandon's family home because he said it made financial sense. I agreed because I wanted to be supportive. I was playing the role of the humble wife, working my teaching job, cooking dinner, doing everything right. Then I got pregnant. I was so happy, so excited to start our family. But something shifted in Brandon. He started coming home late, being distant, snapping at me over little things. His mother got worse too, making comments about how I was trapping her son, how we couldn't afford a baby. I kept quiet, kept trying, kept hoping things would get better. I was 7 months pregnant when I found the text messages. It was a Tuesday evening. Brandon had left his phone on the kitchen counter, and it buzzed with a message. I wasn't trying to snoop, but the preview showed on the screen. It was from someone named Crystal. "Can't wait to see you tonight, baby. Wear that cologne I love." My heart stopped. My hands started shaking. I picked up the phone and saw months of messages, romantic texts, plans to meet up, him complaining about me, about the pregnancy, about feeling trapped. This woman, Crystal Washington, worked with him. They'd been seeing each other for 6 months. I sat on the kitchen floor, crying so hard I thought I'd be sick. My baby was kicking inside me, and all I could think was, how could he do this to us? How could the man who promised to love me, who put a ring on my finger, betray me like this? But I didn't want to be dramatic. I didn't want to explode. So I waited. I collected myself, wiped my tears, and waited for him to come home. He walked in after 11 that night. I was sitting at the dining table with his phone in front of me. "We need to talk," I said quietly. He looked at the phone, and his face went pale. "Aaliyah, I can explain," he started, but I held up my hand. "Are you having an affair with Crystal?" I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. He didn't deny it. Instead, something in him snapped. "You know what?" he said, his voice rising. "Yeah, I am. Because you're not the woman I thought you were. You're boring, you're broke, and now you're pregnant, and I feel trapped." I felt like he'd slapped me, but before I could respond, his mother appeared from upstairs. She must have been listening. "Brandon's right," Diane said, crossing her arms. "You were never good enough for this family. You came from nothing. You are nothing, and you trapped my son with that baby." I stood up, my hands protectively on my belly. "I'm your wife," I said, tears streaming down my face. "I'm carrying your grandchild." Brandon laughed, actually laughed. "That baby is a mistake," he said. "And you need to leave. Pack your stuff and get out." It was midnight, raining outside. I was 7 months pregnant. "Brandon, please," I begged. "Just let me stay tonight. I'll leave in the morning, please." But he was already grabbing my suitcase from the closet, throwing my clothes into it. His mother was pulling things from drawers, shoving them in garbage bags. I was crying, begging them to stop, to think about the baby. You should have thought about that before you trapped him, Diane hissed. Brandon dragged my suitcase to the front door and threw it onto the porch. The rain was pouring down. Brandon, please, I'm pregnant. Where am I supposed to go? I stood in the doorway, soaking wet, watching my husband's face, twisted with disgust. That's not my problem anymore, he said, and slammed the door in my face. I heard the lock click. I stood there in the rain, shaking, crying, feeling like my whole world had just collapsed. Neighbors' lights were on. I knew they were watching. I felt so humiliated, so broken, so alone. I called an Uber with trembling fingers and went to the nearest budget hotel. The clerk looked at me with pity. Pregnant, crying, soaking wet with garbage bags of my belongings. I checked into a room and collapsed on the bed. I cried until I couldn't breathe. I was worried about my baby, about the stress, about everything. At 2 in the morning, I finally called the one person I should have called from the beginning. Daddy, I sobbed into the phone. I need you. My father's voice went cold in a way I'd never heard before. Where are you? He asked. I told him. Stay there. My driver will be there in 20 minutes. We'll talk when you get home. Home. I hadn't been to my father's mansion since my wedding day. When the black Mercedes pulled up, I felt like I was stepping back into a life I'd forgotten. The driver, Martin, had known me since I was a child. He didn't ask questions, just helped me with my bags and drove me to the estate. My father was waiting at the front door in his robe. He's a tall man, dignified, with gray in his hair and eyes that miss nothing. When he saw me, his face crumpled. He hugged me carefully, mindfully of my belly. Come inside, baby girl, he whispered. Inside, everything was exactly as I remembered. My childhood bedroom was untouched, my stuffed animals still on the shelf. My father had kept it like a shrine, waiting for me to come back. We sat in his study, and I told him everything. He listened without interrupting, his jaw clenching tighter and tighter. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked, "What do you want me to do, Aaliyah?" I thought about it. I thought about revenge, about destroying Brandon. But that's not who I am. I want justice, I finally said. I want him to understand what he's done. I want consequences. My father nodded slowly. Then he opened his laptop and showed me something that made my breath catch. Do you know Clark Corporation? He asked. I nodded. That was the company Brandon worked for. He was vice president of sales, proud of his position. Thompson Industries owns 60% of Clark Corporation. My father said. I've been a silent investor for 8 years. Brandon has no idea. I stared at the documents on the screen, my mind racing. I mean, my father interrupted, that your husband works for me, and he just made the biggest mistake of his life. My father called in his lawyer, Gerald Stevens, and his executive assistant, Monica Prince. They'd both known me since I was little. When they saw me pregnant and broken, Monica cried. Gerald just got quiet, in that dangerous way lawyers do when they're planning something. What are we thinking, Thomas? Gerald asked. My father looked at me. We're thinking it's time for some accountability. The plan wasn't about revenge. It was about showing Brandon exactly who he'd thrown away. Monday morning came, and Brandon walked into Clark Corporation like everything was normal. He had no idea that Thompson Industries had called an emergency board meeting. New protocols were announced, performance reviews for all executives, heightened ethics standards. Brandon was nervous, but he thought he was safe. He had good sales numbers, or so he thought. Over the next 2 weeks, things started unraveling for him. First, the ethics department opened an investigation. Someone had reported his relationship with Crystal, who was technically his subordinate. That's a fireable offense. Then his sales records were audited, and some irregularities were found. Not fraud, but sloppy work, inflated numbers, missed targets he'd covered up. The walls were closing in, and Brandon had no idea why. He tried to call me, texted me hundreds of times. I'd blocked him on everything. He couldn't find me because I was living in my father's mansion, in a part of town he didn't even know existed. According to mutual friends, he was panicking. Crystal was pressuring him to make their relationship official, to file for divorce. His mother was in his ear, telling him to get ahead of it all, but he couldn't get ahead of what was coming. Then came the day everything crashed down. Brandon was called to headquarters for a meeting with a representative from Thompson Industries. He walked into that conference room, thinking he could charm his way through whatever this was. Instead, he found Gerald Stevens sitting at the head of the table with a file in front of him. "Mr. Clark," Gerald said formally, "I'm here on behalf of Thomas Thompson, majority shareholder of Clark Corporation." Gerald opened the file and slid a photograph across the table. It was from my childhood, me and my father at one of his corporate events, me in a formal dress with my natural hair done up, looking every bit like the heiress I was born to be. "Do you recognize this woman?" Gerald asked. Brandon stared at the photo, confused. Then Gerald slid another photo across, "My wedding photo." "That's my wife," Brandon said slowly. "Estranged wife," Gerald corrected, "also known as Aaliyah Thompson, daughter of Thomas Thompson, heiress to the Thompson fortune, the woman you threw out of your home while she was 7 months pregnant with your child." I watched the security footage later. My father had it recorded. Brandon's face went from confused to pale to absolutely white. His hands started shaking. "That's not possible," he whispered. "She's a teacher. She's a teacher because she chose to be," Gerald interrupted. "She wanted to find genuine love, so she hid her background. And you proved exactly why she had to." Gerald laid out everything. The affairs with Crystal, the cruelty, the betrayal. Brandon tried to speak, tried to defend himself, but what could he say? Then Gerald delivered the final blow. "You're suspended pending the completion of the ethics investigation. Given the evidence, termination is likely. However, Mr. Thompson is a fair man. He's willing to offer you a choice." That's when Brandon asked for my father's address. He was given the information and told that any decisions about his future would depend on his conversation with me. He drove to the mansion that same day. I watched him on the security cameras as he pulled up in his car, looking small and desperate at the gates. He was begging on the intercom, pleading to see me. My father looked at me and asked, "Do you want to see him?" I surprised myself by saying yes, but on my terms. Brandon was brought into the formal sitting room, the one we used for business associates. I took my time coming down. I'd spent the morning at the salon. My hair was done beautifully. I wore an elegant cream dress that showed off my pregnant belly, and I had my mother's pearls around my neck. When I walked into that room, I wasn't the broken woman he'd thrown out. I was Aaliyah Thompson, and I looked like exactly who I was. Brandon stood up when he saw me, and I watched him take it all in. The mansion, my appearance, the confidence in my walk. "Aaliyah," he started, his voice cracking. "Please, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't understand. Please forgive me." I sat down gracefully and looked at him. Really looked at him. This man who I'd loved, who I'd built a life with, who'd destroyed me without a second thought. "You didn't know what?" I asked calmly. "That I had money? That my father could destroy you?" "No," he stammered. "I mean, yes, but that's not. I'm sorry for how I treated you. I love you. I want to fix this." I almost laughed. "Brandon, you don't love me. You never did. When you thought I was poor, I wasn't good enough. Now that you know I'm rich, suddenly I'm worth fighting for. That's not love. That's greed." I watched him cry, watched him beg, and felt nothing but sadness for the man I thought he was. "Here's what's going to happen," I said. "We're getting divorced. You will sign papers giving me full custody of our child. You will make a public apology for your treatment of me. You will accept whatever consequences come from your job. And in return, my father won't completely destroy you." Brandon looked desperate. "What does that mean?" "It means," I said, "that you'll still have a career. Not at Clark Corporation, but somewhere. You'll start over, at the bottom, where you should have stayed until you learned how to treat people. He agreed to everything. What choice did he have? Within a week, the divorce papers were signed. Crystal was fired for her relationship with a superior. Brandon was terminated, but given a severance package and a reference for entry-level positions at other companies. My father made sure he wasn't blacklisted completely, but his reputation took a hit. His mother, Diane, lost her social standing when word spread about how they'd treated me. The truth has a way of getting out. 3 months later, I gave birth to a beautiful baby girl. I named her Grace, because that's what I chose to give myself when I walked away from people who didn't value me. My father was in the delivery room, crying as he held his granddaughter for the first time. "She looks just like you did," he whispered. "Grace will grow up knowing her worth, knowing she never has to hide who she is to be loved." Sometimes people ask me if I regret hiding my background, if I wish I'd told Brandon from the beginning. The truth is, no, because hiding who I was revealed exactly who he was. If he'd known about my father's money, he would have treated me differently. But not because he loved me more. He would have been playing a different game, that's all. At least this way, I know I dodged a bullet. I know my daughter deserves better than a father who only values wealth over character. My father didn't destroy Brandon completely. He actually helped him get a job at a smaller company, in sales, starting from the bottom. He's working his way back up, hopefully learning some humility along the way. I don't wish him harm, I just wish him understanding. Understanding that people are not disposable, that pregnant women deserve protection, not cruelty, that love should be unconditional, not transactional. If this story touched you, hit that like button. Subscribe if you believe in karma and standing up for yourself. Comment below with, "I know my worth," if you're walking away from anyone who doesn't value you. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And remember, never dim your light for people who can't handle your shine. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destruction. It's simply letting someone see exactly what they lost. I'll see you in the next story. This is Aaliyah Thompson, reminding you, you are enough, exactly as you are.
When Regina found out her billionaire husband was cheating, she didn't cry or beg. Instead, she threw the most expensive divorce party in Manhattan history and invited everyone who mattered, including the one person who could destroy his empire forever. What happened next shocked everyone, especially his racist mother. Before we dive into this incredible story of revenge and justice, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this brilliant woman turned her darkest moment into her greatest victory. Now, let's get into this wild story. Picture this: a 34-year-old woman standing in her marble kitchen overlooking Central Park from the 42nd floor of a Manhattan penthouse worth $50 million. Regina Williams had everything most people dream of. She was a successful interior designer whose work graced the pages of Architectural Digest. Her husband, Jonathan Hayes, was a tech billionaire whose company was valued at $3 billion. They lived in a world of private jets, exclusive galas, and vacation homes in 3 different countries. But here's the thing about perfect lives: they're usually built on foundations that aren't as solid as they appear. Regina had spent 8 years trying to fit into a world that never really wanted her there. Not because she wasn't smart enough, successful enough, or accomplished enough. The problem was simpler and uglier than that. She was black, and her mother-in-law, Patricia Hayes, had never let her forget it. Patricia was old money, the kind of woman who spoke in coded language and smiled while delivering the cruelest cuts. She had made it clear from day one that Regina would never be good enough for her precious son. During family dinners, Patricia would make comments about how Regina must feel so grateful for the opportunities she'd been given. She'd suggest that Regina's success was somehow tied to Jonathan's connections, never acknowledging that Regina had built her own business from nothing. Jonathan? He just stood by and let it happen. He'd tell Regina she was being too sensitive, or that his mother didn't mean it that way. For 8 years, Regina had swallowed her pride and played the part of the grateful wife, thinking that eventually love would win out. She thought that if she just worked harder, achieved more, and proved herself over and over again, she'd finally earned the respect she deserved. That illusion came crashing down on a Tuesday morning in March. Jonathan had left for what he said was a business trip to San Francisco. Regina was in his home office looking for some financial documents their accountant needed when she knocked over a stack of papers near his computer. As she bent down to pick them up, she saw something that made her blood run cold. Hotel receipts. Not from San Francisco, but from hotels right there in New York. The dates matched up with his supposed business trips. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was seeing charges for couples' spa treatments, expensive jewelry from Tiffany, and romantic dinners for two at restaurants she'd never been to with her own husband. My hands were shaking as I dug deeper into his papers. Credit card statements showed a pattern going back 3 years. 3 years of lies, 3 years of hotels, gifts, and romantic getaways with someone who wasn't his wife. The amounts were staggering. He was spending more on his affairs than most people made in a year. Then I found the text messages on an old phone he'd forgotten in his desk drawer. Messages between Jonathan and someone named Ashley, his executive assistant. The same woman who'd been nothing but professional and respectful whenever I'd met her at company events. The messages were explicit, romantic, and they made one thing crystal clear. This wasn't just physical. He was telling her he loved her. But the message that broke me wasn't from Ashley. It was from Patricia, his mother, sent just 2 weeks earlier. "I told you that woman would never fit into our family. Ashley understands our world. She understands what you need. It's time to make the right choice for your future." Jonathan had responded, "You're right, Mom. I should have listened to you years ago." That's when I realized the truth. This wasn't just about an affair. This was about a mother and son who had been planning to get rid of me all along. Sitting there in Jonathan's office, surrounded by evidence of his betrayal, I had 2 choices. I could fall apart like they expected me to, or I could get smart. I chose smart. The first thing I did was take pictures of everything, every receipt, every text message, every piece of evidence that showed Jonathan's 3-year pattern of infidelity. Then I called my friend Carmen Rodriguez, one of the best divorce attorneys in New York. We'd met at a charity gala 5 years earlier, and she'd always told me that if I ever needed anything, I should call her. Well, I was calling. Carmen came over that same afternoon. When I showed her what I'd found, her eyes lit up like a kid on Christmas morning. "Regina," she said, "you're not just getting a divorce. You're about to become very, very wealthy." She explained that New York had specific laws about adultery, and more importantly, Jonathan had been using marital assets to fund his affairs. Every hotel room, every piece of jewelry, every romantic dinner was technically theft from our marriage. But Carmen saw something else in those financial records that I'd missed. "Look at these business expenses," she said, pointing to several charges. "He's been using company credit cards for personal affairs. That's embezzlement. And if we can prove he's been hiding income from you during the marriage—" She didn't need to finish that sentence. I understood. Over the next few days, I did something I'd never done before in my marriage. I started paying attention to Jonathan's business dealings. Really paying attention. See, for 8 years, I'd been the dutiful wife who smiled and nodded when he talked about work, but I'd never actually listened. I'd been too busy trying to prove I belonged in his world to notice what was really happening in that world. What I discovered was fascinating. Jonathan's company, Hayes Technologies, wasn't just successful because of his brilliant mind like everyone believed. It was successful because it had landed several massive government contracts that required strict diversity requirements. Companies had to prove they were inclusive, fair, and committed to social justice to win these deals. Jonathan's marriage to me had been a huge part of that image. His company's entire public relations strategy was built around being progressive and inclusive. Jonathan gave speeches about equality and opportunity. He sat on boards of organizations that fought discrimination. He'd even won awards for his commitment to diversity in tech, and all of it was a lie. I started researching his biggest competitors, and one name kept coming up: Michael Thompson. Michael was another tech billionaire, but unlike Jonathan, he'd actually built his success through legitimate means. More importantly, Michael had been trying to expose companies that used fake diversity initiatives to win contracts. He'd been investigating Hayes Technologies for months, but couldn't prove anything. That's when I realized I had something more valuable than just evidence of an affair. I had evidence that could destroy Jonathan's entire empire. I spent the next week documenting everything. I discovered that Patricia's racist comments weren't just private family moments. She'd made similar remarks at charity events and social gatherings, always thinking she was among friends who shared her views. I had witnesses, recordings from my phone when I'd started documenting her behavior months earlier, and a pattern of discrimination that went back years. But the real goldmine came when I accessed Jonathan's personal financial records. Carmen had given me the legal right to review all marital assets during our divorce proceedings. What I found there was beyond anything I'd imagined. Jonathan wasn't just cheating on me, he was cheating on his taxes. He'd been hiding income in offshore accounts, claiming personal expenses as business deductions, and using a complex web of shell companies to avoid paying millions in taxes. The best part? He'd been sloppy about it because he never thought I was smart enough to understand his business. He'd underestimated me for 8 years, and that arrogance was about to cost him everything. I knew I couldn't just expose this information through normal legal channels. It would take years to work through the courts, and by then, Jonathan could hide or destroy evidence. I needed something bigger, something public, something that would make it impossible for him to recover. That's when I came up with the idea for the divorce party. Not just any party, the most expensive, most exclusive, most talked about event Manhattan had seen in years. I would invite everyone who mattered in Jonathan's world, his investors, his business partners, his competitors, and most importantly, the media. I would create an event so spectacular that everyone would want to attend, including Jonathan and Patricia themselves. They would come because they couldn't resist the opportunity to publicly humiliate me one last time. They would expect to find a broken woman throwing a pathetic cry for attention. Instead, they were going to walk into a carefully orchestrated trap that would expose them for exactly who they really were. I had the evidence, I had the plan, and now I had the perfect stage. Jonathan and Patricia thought they were so much smarter than me. They were about to learn just how wrong they'd been. The night of the party, I stood in the ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, watching Manhattan's elite filter through the doors. I'd spared no expense: crystal chandeliers, champagne fountains, a string quartet, and enough caviar to feed a small country. The guest list read like a who's who of New York society: tech investors, media moguls, politicians, and of course, Michael Thompson, who'd arrived early and was watching everything with keen interest. I was wearing a custom black gown that cost more than most people's cars, my hair and makeup flawless. I looked like a woman celebrating, not mourning. Because that's exactly what I was doing, celebrating the end of a lie and the beginning of my real life. The whispers started the moment I walked into the room. People were confused. This wasn't how a devastated wife was supposed to behave. Where were the tears? Where was the breakdown? Instead, they saw a woman who looked more powerful and confident than she ever had before. Around 9 o'clock, exactly when I'd predicted, Jonathan and Patricia made their grand entrance. They hadn't been invited, but they couldn't resist the opportunity to crash my party and humiliate me in front of everyone who mattered. Patricia was wearing her most expensive jewelry, and Jonathan had that smug smile he always wore when he thought he was about to win. They walked straight up to me, Patricia's voice carrying across the room. "Regina, dear, what a interesting way to handle your little situation, though I suppose we shouldn't expect anything more dignified from someone of your background." The conversations around us stopped. Cell phones started recording. This was exactly what I'd been waiting for. "You know what, Patricia?" I said, my voice calm and clear. "You're absolutely right. Let's talk about backgrounds." I pulled out my phone and connected it to the sound system I'd had installed specifically for this moment. Patricia's own voice filled the ballroom, crystal clear from recordings I'd made over the years. People like her don't belong in families like ours. She's just after his money. I told you that woman would never fit into our family. It's time to make the right choice for your future." The room went dead silent. You could see the horror dawning on faces throughout the crowd as they realized what they were hearing. These weren't just private family disagreements. This was systematic, deliberate racism from one of New York's most prominent socialites. But I wasn't done. "And Jonathan," I continued, "since we're talking about backgrounds, let's discuss yours." I pulled out a folder thick with documents. 3 years of affairs, funded with marital assets, company credit cards used for personal expenses, and my personal favorite, $47 million in unpaid taxes hidden in offshore accounts. I turned to address the room full of investors and business partners. "Everything you've invested in, every contract Hayes Technologies has won based on their commitment to diversity and integrity, it's all been built on lies." Michael Thompson stepped forward, his voice carrying across the stunned ballroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to announce that as of tomorrow morning, Thompson Industries will be acquiring all outstanding shares of Hayes Technologies. Jonathan, consider this your official notice." The party had become a funeral, the death of Jonathan's empire, broadcast live to everyone who mattered. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my new office overlooking the Hudson River, the CEO of Williams Design Group, the fastest-growing interior design firm in the country. Michael Thompson became my business partner, and together we've built something extraordinary, a company that actually lives up to the values Jonathan only pretended to have. Jonathan's empire? Gone. Hayes Technologies declared bankruptcy within 3 months. The IRS seized his assets, and he's facing criminal charges for tax evasion. He's living in a studio apartment in Queens now, working as a consultant for a fraction of his former salary. Patricia had to sell her Fifth Avenue mansion to pay her legal bills. Turns out, being recorded making racist comments at charity events didn't just cost her socially. Several organizations sued her for discrimination. She's persona non grata in the circles she used to rule. Last week, I sent them a housewarming gift for their new studio apartment, a small cactus with a note that read, "For your new beginning. Some things are designed to survive in harsh conditions. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even, it's getting everything."